of course. All right. I forgot that you were in Michigan. I assumed you were on the East Coast.
I used to be.
Yeah.
Oh,
All right. Hi, Kate. Kate, I'm going to make you a co-host.
hi, Kate.
She can't talk yet. I don't know why that was doing that. There she is.
Hi, Kate.
Hey, Rich, how are you?
Good. How are you doing? You look great.
Thank you. You look great too. Retirement suits you.
It certainly does, in more ways than you can imagine. So,
Robert and Diana are here. We were talking about your creme brulee and clam pizza this weekend.
oh, sounds good. Maybe I'll make that tonight.
Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to hang back and help out with the Q&A and chat questions, links, and that sort of thing. But it sure is good to see you. Even if
you too.
is
Listen, I was telling Kim that the Human Rights Institute at UConn, I was talking to Kathy Lieball the other day. I'm going to go back there in April and give a talk. She's really interested in your organization, and she's going to contact you. UConn got some big grant. They haven't announced it yet. The Institute did, to start a summer.
Just to be clear, we're recording, and do we have participants on the line, Kim, before you go any further?
Just a few.
Okay, great. Sorry, Rich, just in case there's anything here that's proprietary.
No, okay. I'll just say that UConn is interested in starting a summer institute for K through 12 human rights teachers.
Oh,
Yeah.
outstanding. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So I told them about you, and she said, well, this is who we have to talk to. So you'll be hearing.
We know Glenn, partly because
It might be Glenn who contacts you.
that'd be great, because we know him because he works closely with one of our board members, John Heffernan. So there's all kinds of UConn links, and John used to be, until they recently changed it, he was on the advisory panel for the Dodd Center.
The Dodd Center is now the Dodd Human Rights Center.
Right, and it's like Dodd Now or something, or there's
something now, yes.
yes.
But President Biden showed up there last week, sort of on the spur of the moment.
Oh, really?
Well, Kathy said they didn't know if he was going to come, so she couldn't invite anybody like board members. I'm on the governing board because they weren't sure when he was coming, and he'd already canceled a couple of times. So they called like 2 days ahead of time and said he's going to be there.
Well, yeah, I would love to talk more about that. That sounds terrific. Hey, Becky, how are you? It's good to see you too. Becky's a regular. She's attended a number of these in the past, so I'm particularly pleased to see you coming back for more. And I'm excited to learn more about your book because, as you know, the UNCRC is something that we've held near and dear to our hearts for quite some time, dating back to when certain people were in high school. So it'll be fantastic to hear what your thoughts are on it. I'm
going to talk about that very early in the presentation.
Excellent.
It's shocking that we haven't ratified it. But.
Yeah. And then as I was reading the number of ways that it's been put in front of people and just hasn't been a priority. So I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts on the political reasons why it may or may not be a priority.
There used to be 2 reasons. There's one remaining.
Okay.
It's becoming a bigger impediment all the time.
Okay.
I'll just give you that little teaser.
Okay. All right. Well, we're now definitely international. We have Alma with us, and Alma is the lead EIHR staff member in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Oh, wonderful.
She's here. I know we had a number of people sign up from Bosnia. I know we had a lot of interest in Rwanda and in DRC. And then we had a lot of people signing up from the US. So, it should be.
And because it's recorded, those who can't, I know some sign up knowing that they can't attend, but they'll watch the recording. So,
and at some point, Rich, what would be interesting, and maybe you have this in your in your plans, is to hear how your book on green human rights relates to this work.
It's part of this talk.
Great, excellent. Because I thought, well, there's a through line that will be interesting to hear about.
There is that I never saw actually until I started writing this book. I never thought of it, that, wow, this just absolutely follows from the last one. So weird when that happens.
Oh, more people from Sarajevo. Hello.
Yes. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started and honor everybody's time. So hello and welcome. I'm Kim Klett, Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. Founded by teachers for teachers, EIHR supports communities recovering from violent conflict. We do this by applying lessons from the Holocaust and other egregious violations of human rights, such as the Rwanda genocide, as a starting point for teaching secondary school students about how these conflicts evolve and how to prevent them. Please learn more about our work at eihr.org. So I would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. At EIHR, we hope to inspire action in supporting our Indigenous communities. We recognize our native lands in gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and honor the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. I am in Mesa, Arizona, on the land of the O'odham, and our office in K Street in Washington, D.C. is on the land of the Piscataway. If you're joining us here today in the U.S. and would like to see on whose land you reside, I will put the link in the chat box so you can find that information on the land map. Today's webinar with Richard Hiskes is one of a series focused on the human rights of children. We hope you can join us next Sunday when we will discuss the 1619 project with representatives from the Pulitzer Center. I am putting the registration link for that in the chat box, or Kate will, thank you. On December 5th, we will continue our learning about the Yazidis with Abed and Olivia from Nadia's initiative. That webinar will focus on the book, The Last Girl, by Nobel Peace Prize recipient Nadia Murad. We hope you can read the book and join us for what promises to be an interesting conversation. And even if you don't get to read the book, we hope you'll be able to join us. And here is that link in the chat box as well. So now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Richard Hiskes. Richard Hiskes is Professor Emeritus in Political Science and Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. At UConn, he was Associate Director of the Human Rights Institute and Founder Director of the Human Rights Major. A former editor of the Journal of Human Rights, he was twice elected President of the Human Rights Division of the American Political Science Association. He has written widely in political theory and human rights, and his 2009 book, The Human Right to a Green Future, Environmental Rights and Intergenerational Justice, Cambridge, won the 2010 APSA Award for Best Book in Human Rights. Today, he is speaking on his new book from Oxford, Suffer the Children, A Theoretical Foundation for the Human Rights of the Child. Rich, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Kate. Thanks to EIHR, and thank you for everybody who's tuning in. I have a sort of a formal presentation, but I'd like to start with a question just to some people in the audience. It's wonderful to be speaking to human rights teachers. And so I'd like to begin by asking a question that I think should have been asked a lot more during the past 12, 18 months by policymakers and adults generally. And that is, broadly, how have the past 12 to 18 months been for children? Have they suffered? Even though for a long time, most of them remained relatively untouched by, at least physically, by the pandemic. But if you have a chat, if you want to add something to a chat, I'd love to hear it. That have they been harmed? Have they, by choices they've made or been made for them? I'm thinking of things like isolation, poor learning environment, exposure to the virus. And as we'll see, harms are what give rise to rights. Rights and harms are intimately connected. And if children have been harmed by the decisions made for them during the past year or so, does that mean their rights have been violated? Can they sue somebody if their rights have been violated? Well, I think the answer to that question is only if children have rights. So my question is to all of us, do they? And my screen just went sort of dark. Am I being heard or visible? I hope.
Yeah.
Heard and
Okay.
visible. We're just getting you center stage.
Oh, okay, fine.
And
I'll
if
just keep-
anybody wants to put answers in the chat box, I'll share those. We got one from Matthew Good. He said a lack of social interaction.
Lack of social interaction. Yep. Certainly an important one. One reviewer of my book declared that Hiskes's book makes the radical and controversial claim that children are human beings. Damn, I wish I'd said that. That's really good. It's also true that is the purpose of my book, and it's my purpose today, to argue, to discuss with you that as fully human creatures, children should be given full human rights. It's also my purpose to eliminate how doing so will accomplish some other worthy goals too. First of all, I want to provide a new, more accurate picture of why human beings have human rights in the first place. I mean, what is our special ingredient? What is it that we have as a species that grants us these special things called rights? Secondly, I'll show that even more than adults, children manifest those special things that entitle us to rights. And so obviously, they should possess rights too. And I'll give you a spoiler alert here, not just human rights. I'm going to argue that children deserve full citizenship and full citizenship rights as well. Thirdly, what I'm going to do here will result in a kind of shifting of the priority among human rights. Which ones are the most important? Historically, the political, legal rights of the person, like against torture and trafficking, those are considered the most important rights. And ones like socioeconomic rights, education rights, those are the ones that affect children most, are the ones that are generally considered not real rights, or at least, second or third generation rights. Finally, I'm going to argue that in addition to revolutionizing our understanding of rights, granting citizenship rights to children will, I think, serve to really reinvigorate the context of human rights, which is, and I think has to be, democracy, democratic practices. So that's a lot to cover, but I think that we can get done. I'm going to speak for about a half hour or so. So there's time for questions. So why is it necessary to make this argument? Why is it necessary to, as I say, establish a theoretical foundation for the human rights of children? Why do I say that? Two reasons. The first isn't a reason, it's statistics. There has to be statistics because I'm a social scientist and we do this. Every nation in the world except one has ratified the UNCRC, that's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in 1990. I think you can probably guess which nation is the one that refuses to ratify, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But even though all those countries have ratified this list of 30 rights that the UN claims that children have, it's still the case that worldwide, 150 million children remain in forced labor. 150 million. Now think about that. If those 150 million human beings were in one place, it would be the 9th biggest country in the world. 150 million people. Since they're children, they're just not that visible. Maybe that's one part of the problem. 10 million of the 40 million slaves that still exist in the world are under 15 years old. That's a figure from Free the Slaves organization. In the United States, 21% of children live below the poverty line and therefore suffer daily food insecurity every day. That makes us rank 34th in the world in child welfare. We're number 34. Now, I should say that this figure has been cut in half by President Biden's Pandemic Emergency Fund and the Children's Tax Credit, but will expire if it isn't renewed. And right now, it's set to expire in just a few weeks. If it does expire, if the Build Back Better plan isn't approved, then thanks to Joe Manchin, then 11.5% more children in the United States will go back to living below the poverty line. So that's the first, those statistics are shocking. And to me, this just shows that the world doesn't really believe that children have human rights. The second reason is a more broad one. It's simply that there's never been an argument for children's rights. There's never been a full theoretical foundation for children's rights. That's what I try to provide in my book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about today. The historic theory of rights beginning in the 17th century, you've probably heard of them as natural rights. Jefferson called them inalienable rights. They're different from constitutional rights, obviously, because they're universal for all human beings, except for the fact that that theory that begins in the 17th century that was embraced by people like Jefferson and Washington specifically excludes children as rights bearers, and women too, of course, and non-white men. That's changed a bit, but it's still the case that children are not considered to have, even though the CRC says they have them, the world doesn't act as if it believes children have human rights. Let's talk a little bit about the United States and the CRC. Why is it that we have refused to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Bill Clinton did sign it, but if you know how treaties work in this country, in most countries, unless a treaty is ratified in this country by the Senate, then the treaty does not function as American law. It might bind an administration like the Clinton administration, but not subsequent ones. So it has to be ratified. Why did we reject it? There's a couple reasons. The first one was that the CRC made it illegal to carry out capital punishment against people under the age of 18. And in this country, certain areas of the country that embrace capital punishment rather enthusiastically, there were plenty of people on death row under the age of 18, children, mostly in Texas, but in a few other places too. Child capital punishment was banned by the Supreme Court in 2005 in an important case. So there still remains one reason, and I think it's even more important today. It was very visible in the governor's campaign and election in Virginia just a couple of weeks ago. This is the argument that giving children's rights will conflict with the rights of parents. Do parents have rights? I mean, do parents have rights that are different than the rights they have as humans or as citizens? What about grandparents? I can't see if you're going to raise your hand. If any grandparents watching this, maybe we should ask whether grandparents have rights too. And we should, because the most important case in American Supreme Court law was between the rights of grandparents and the rights of parents. Does it make sense to say that everybody has the same rights until they have a child? Then they get more rights. I don't think it does, but the Supreme Court disagrees with me. Like the right to privacy and abortion rights in the United States, the Supreme Court has recognized parental rights, or it calls them liberty interests under the 14th Amendment. But it's important to recognize that even though conservative justices approve these rights, the most conservative of all, Justice Scalia, did not. He dissented in a case called Troxel versus Granville, because he said the word parent or child never appears anywhere in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights. So if you want to say that there's something called parent rights, you're going to have to change the Constitution. And indeed, a parental rights amendment has been proposed in every Congress for the past 20 years. It hasn't, it's never gotten anywhere, but who knows? It's become a Republican talking point now. So if they take control of the Senate next time, it might. Two cases are important here. One is called Wisconsin versus Yoder in 1972. In this case, an Amish farmer named Yoder took his 15-year-old son out of school against violating Wisconsin law, saying that he didn't need to know any more to become an Amish father than he'd already learned. And the Supreme Court said the father had the right to do that. It called it sort of a cultural right, which is a little messy, but nowhere was it discussed that maybe the son had a right to decide for himself what he wanted to do with his life. Because if you want to be more than an Amish farmer, you need more than a sophomore in high school education. The other case that's important is called Troxel versus Granville. And this is an interesting one. A married man with 2 children commits suicide. And his widow denies visitation rights to the father's parents, to the grandparents of the children, for a variety of reasons. But the grandparents sue the mother, and the court decides with the mother that parents have the right even to restrict grandparental visits. Well, let's think about that just for a minute. Does it make sense to say that parents have the right to decide what to feed their children, how to educate their children, whether to provide health care for their children, because they have those rights? Or is it because children have the right to food, the right to education, the right to health care? Parents don't have, it's not an absolute right, certainly. Parents don't have the right not to feed their children or to restrict all health care. If they think they do, they'll find out pretty quickly when they're arrested for child abuse. So it seems to me that what we really should be saying here is that children have those basic rights, but parents have some kind of proxy authority to be responsible for them. So what is it about human beings as being endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights that makes it obvious that they don't apply to children? What's this special ingredient that human beings have that entitles us to rights? And how do we know that it's missing in children until they reach some magic, age of consent? And how do we know it was missing in women and non-white men for a long time? Well, historically men like Jefferson, Locke, and Paine said what was special about humans was our reason, our rationality, our ability to understand the difference between right and wrong, to understand natural law, they said. And therefore, as Immanuel Kant said, we can be morally autonomous to make and obey our own rules. We are moral people who can make moral decisions. This meant firstly that humans, white men, had the right to be free, to make their own decisions about what the natural law dictated, and also to establish government. And so the United States, in its founding documents, incorporated the rights of all men that are created equal. Now, the world has come to believe that women and non-white men also are equal and have those rights, but not children. So that has to mean either that children really don't have reason until reaching some age, and therefore are not really human before they reach that age, and some philosophers argue this. Or maybe reason is obviously not the foundation of human rights, and the proof is that it leaves children out, even though everyone agrees, kind of, sort of, that they're human. My argument is the second idea, that we need a new foundation for human rights. It's more accurate in describing what it is about humans that gives us rights. And that foundation will include children as rights holders on 3 grounds. First of all, I would say that what makes humans different than all other species is what Thomas Hobbes, the first human rights, natural rights theorist in the 17th century, said. He said, what sets us apart is our ability to produce amazing things: agriculture, ships, great art, museums, the internet, space travel, because of our capacity to do so together based on our ability to make promises. He often calls them contracts, but we come together on the basis of a mutual promise. And when we do that, we can really get things done. We are special as a species. And since the ability to make promises it is what defines us as a species, more so than our capacity for reason, I like to say we are a very promising species. Hobbes argues that we logically then have the right to do that because it is what is special, the one special ability that we have. So basing rights on the capacity to promise indicates the thing that gives us right is, first of all, not something that we have or manifest alone, but what we do together. Rights come not so much from within us individually because of some private solitary ability we have. Rights come from between us. Rights are based on relationships. They are very social things. If you think of Robinson Crusoe, the fictional character stranded on a desert island, he has lots of complaints to make about his life. But does he have any rights? Can he say, I have a right to get off this island? Or who's he going to say it to? He's alone. Incidentally, this sort of resolves the debate about whether rights are socially constructed or whether they're foundational or innate in us. The answer is both. We have the capacity, the special capacity to make promises and enter relationships from which our rights come. So before we move on to the second basis of human rights, I want to make it very clear that, in my opinion, children also at a very young age understand what a promise is, why it's important. If you're a parent, you've had a child confront you and say, you promised. That's a real claim. That's a right demand there. And why breaking them is wrong. Children understand this at a very young age. I think that they qualify on that first ground for qualifying for rights. The second foundation also comes from Hobbes. He says that as a species, we are uniquely vulnerable when we practice that one thing that makes us special as a species, that is promising, working together. Hobbes says, because we can't read each other's minds, and in every contract, somebody has to act first. That leaves the other person vulnerable. I mean, you and I make a promise. You do this, and I'll do this, I promise. But you don't know if I'm telling you the truth or if I'm trustworthy. So this comes from Wright Law School Court Contracts 101. All contracts are unequal because they require someone to act first. And once that person acts first, that person is vulnerable. So Hobbes says, the first right that the human species has is the right to establish government, because government's function is to enforce contracts. Now remember that vulnerability is what rights are for, to protect us from harms. And here too, children are the most vulnerable of all humans. So if vulnerability is one of the foundations for rights, as well as the capacity to make promises, it seems that their rights would be very clear and maybe the most important. Martha Nussbaum, probably the most famous philosopher in the world today, points out that children are vulnerable not only because they're small and weak and dependent, because that's true about a lot of adults, some adults anyway. What's unique about children's vulnerability is that they don't have the power that Hobbes gives to adults to overcome it. Children do not have the power to establish or participate in government. So it's no wonder that democratic governments pay so little attention to what harms children, pay so little attention to what the UN calls the best interests of the child. In the US, that is just that attention is transferred to parents. So if the foundation of the argument that if children really do have human rights, they have to include the political power to vote in a democracy, this is a pretty powerful statement that children should have that power. It is the only way that government will pay attention to their vulnerability, to what they require. Now, the Convention on the Rights of the Child does give children for the first time the right to participate. It's pretty vague about what that means. Voting isn't vague, it's pretty straightforward. The CRC is important because, and it's accepted in 1990 and is ratified pretty quickly by most countries until just one remains that hasn't. The CRC talks about three different kinds of rights, the human rights that children have. Rights of provision, that would be food, education, a home, and so forth. Rights of protection, legal and personal. These are not very controversial. People believe that children deserve to be provided for and protected. And thirdly, it adds rights of participation. The CRC says explicitly that children have the right to participate in all decisions which affect their lives. Doesn't say what participation means. And frankly, no children participated in the writing of the CRC, which is either hilariously ironic or grossly hypocritical, depending on your point of view. I tend toward the latter. In most countries, democratic or otherwise, children remain without any real political clout, although some countries have experimented with children's congresses, advisory votes, and so forth. Vulnerability in a political sense still defines children. I don't know about your experience, or many teachers here, I think here listening to this, I think, were children ever consulted during the pandemic about school closings, about the loss of social activities, the resulting isolation? Where I am, there were no widespread public hearings where children were heard at all. I still find that fairly astonishing. So the third basis of children's rights lies in the recognition of their group status, their groupness, like other groups. Black Lives Matter is a kind of group claim. Group rights is a modern idea that is controversial. It arises from the fact of group identity, either in the eyes of members of the group looking to protect themselves from harm, or more commonly, in the eyes of non-group members whose actions, beliefs, prejudices, etc., threaten to harm members of the group simply for being members of the group. Now, the best example of this, is, of course, in the 20th century was genocide, 21st century too. Genocide is, you may know, Winston Churchill said in 1943, apparently the Nazis are committing a crime for which there is no name. The word genocide was invented in response to the Holocaust. And it gives rise to a very specific right. The group right not to be a victim of genocide. Now, I always ask my students, what's the difference between genocide and 6 million discrete acts of murder? Why do we need a new name for it? What's different in genocide than just the murder of 6 million people? And the answer is, of course, that it's an attempt to eradicate not just individuals, but a people, a culture, a group. Once the idea that genocide is a real crime has been accepted, and it has been accepted in international law, then it pretty much establishes the whole idea of group rights, at least the group right not to be a victim of genocide. Now, again, I want to argue that no group alive is more visibly or immediately recognizable as a group than our children. And the example I want to talk about a little bit here is environmental human rights and how they specifically apply to children. My previous book was on the idea of environmental human rights. And by the way, the UN 3 weeks ago, for the first time, officially recognized, the UN Human Rights Council and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, officially recognized environmental human rights as human rights. They were not in the UDHR. But when I define them, I say simply the right to clean air, clean water, and clean soil. Sometimes it's called the right to a safe environment. That recognition is a big deal. President Joe Biden would say it's a BFD, but I'm not going to unpack that. So let me say a few things about environmental rights as I think of them and as they've now been accepted by the UN. that specifically relate to children. Environmental rights logically apply to future generations first. In other words, I've argued that the holders of environmental rights are, first of all, future generations. Now, why do I say that? We know we all live with environmental risks, which are getting worse. In America, we don't think that there's a right to be protected from risk. Quite the opposite. We claim a right to embrace risk for monetary reasons or whatever. But they belong to future generations because that's where the harm is. We live with environmental risk. Future people will live with the devastating harm that our environmental predations have produced. All rights are future-oriented things. They're all about guarantees for the future. But future generations have human rights first. And secondly, that means they belong to children first among living generations, because children are the first living future generation. I know that sounds a little odd thing to say, but children are the first of future generations. So children get environmental rights before parents, that we're going to see in a minute. There's lots of very young children all around the world who are making this case in courts and on the streets and so forth. Thirdly, and this one always blows me away, children today are being harmed by environmental hazards, not just subjected to risk. Children are already feeling the harm of a polluted environment. The UN Special Rapporteur for toxic waste memorably announced about 10 years ago that, and this is what he said, I'm quoting, "Children are being born already polluted." Children are being born already polluted with environmental toxins that are in their body, absorbed through their mother's uterus while they were still in utero. Before they're born, they're already suffering environmental harm. Those kids deserve rights related to those harms. Also, a Netherlands study in 2016 estimates that 3.5 million children die every year from environmental related diseases right now. Respiratory infections, diarrhea diseases, and malaria, 3 examples. Now, the last thing I'll say about environmental rights in children is that child activists around the world are well aware of the harm they face, that they are experiencing, and they're making the case for environmental human rights of children. I'll give you just a few examples. I want to save some time here for us to have some questions. In the United States, there's a famous case that was decided last year called Juliana versus the United States. 21 children aged 8 to 19 sued the United States government for violating their right to life by continuing to rely on fossil fuels. Twice the Supreme Court was asked to dismiss the case while it was working its way up the system. Twice the Supreme Court said, no, this is a real case. You got to decide this. The appeal court, it finally lost in the appeal court last year, the 2-to-1 vote. There's 3 judges in appellate courts. And they lost, but it was, the dissenting opinion was so powerful, written by a woman named Judge Statton, that this case has already been the basis for more cases being filed in this country on the basis of children's environmental rights and cases around the world. Another example, environmental rights activist Greta Thunberg addressed the UN's climate summit at the age of 15 in 2018. Last week, the Glasgow summit is wrapping up. Last week, she was leading some major demonstrations there as well, but she was only 15. Couldn't vote yet, but she could address the summit. She also addressed Parliament that year. She had started her work many years before that. President Trump ridiculed her when she won Times Person of the Year that year, of course. In Colombia in 2018, appellants ranging in age from 7 to 26 sued the government for Amazon deforestation, and they won. Government had to change policies. In India in 2017, 9-year-old Ridhima Pandey filed a petition charging the Indian government with failure to implement emission standards to mitigate climate change. She won. In 2016, Pakistani Rabab Ali, a very young girl, age 7, filed a climate change petition with the Pakistan Supreme Court. She also won. Now you could say, well, they had lawyers. Well, so do all adults when they go into court. We could add more. Malala Yousafzai, who just got married last week. When she was 8, she had started her girls' education rights blog. She won the Nobel at 17. David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez from Florida began their national movement to restrict guns at age 17. The point I want to make here is just this. There is truly a new age for human rights. And by that, I mean chronological age. All these activists have been aided by a mushrooming set of international NGOs that serve as legal clearinghouses, information clearinghouses, legal advice and legal help, set up specifically for child activism, and by new organizing techniques relying on social media, international movement networks, all this stuff that teenagers know how to use, and I'm way too old to know how to use. So for many reasons, environmental rights are the paradigm for all rights, in my opinion. They're relational, they protect us from harm, they're collective in the sense that environmental harm is collective and therefore affect all human beings. They're universal, in other words. And they belong most clearly, with priority, to children first. They are the ones suffering the effects of climate change now, and they will live with the harm that we produce the longest of any living person today. So what I want to suggest by way of conclusion here is that formally acknowledging the human rights of children and giving them the democratic power to claim them through voting rights will change human rights forever. Beginning with children really changes human rights, not only in our arguments about where rights come from and why we have them, and it will change democracy fundamentally as well, for the good, I think. The place where all rights are most at home. I'm going to close with just a couple of comments on those 2 points. First of all, children's human and citizenship rights and the impact on democracy. There's a political theorist at Cambridge University named David Runciman, and he reminds us that democracy as a governmental form has pretty much reached middle age by now, and it's beginning to show some aging pains. Arguably, it's not expanding globally at the moment, and is in fact being challenged in several countries: Hungary, Turkey, Poland, and many would say in the United States. I think enfranchising children will rejuvenate democracy and help it recover its youthful energy. Runciman points out that every time the suffrage rights are expanded, democracies have sort of experienced this period of excitement and activity to educate the new voters. And I think that extending the vote to children would open up great opportunities for civic renewal and civic action as every society endeavors to educate its new voters on the blessings and responsibilities of voting. In this country, it might mean that many more adults start voting because they're going to have to help educate their children about how they should vote. Now, it's easy to say that children aren't capable of voting. And many of the reasons that will be given will be the same reasons given for why women should be denied the vote, why former slaves should be denied the vote, and in the United States, why anyone younger than 21 should be given the vote. I would say that those arguments were always prejudicial and false. And they're just as prejudicial and just as false now, except for the fact that they're probably true for some people who do vote, who are old enough to vote. Maybe some of those criticisms adequately and accurately characterize voters today. I don't want to go into details. We can do this during the Q&A about registration and so forth. You might be surprised, though, how unique and uniquely retrograde the United States is, in how difficult it makes it for people to register to vote. There's only 4 other countries in the world that make it as difficult to register to vote than the United States. And it's not a club that we would want to be part of, if I tell you the other 4 countries. Some individual states in the United States are more progressive. Michigan makes it somewhat easier. You can register to vote when you renew your driver's license. Some Western states, I think that you're automatically registered to vote. There's plenty of ways to do it much more easily, and many countries are doing that. Of course, right now, many states in the United States are trying to make it harder. They're trying to turn the clock back. What age should children be when they start to vote? Runciman says 6. When they're 6 years old and they can read the ballot, they should vote. Professor John Wall of Rutgers says they should have the right to vote from birth, but it can be exercised by their parents on a proxy basis until the children are ready. I don't know what ready means. Maybe when they start demanding the right to do it themselves. I would probably say 9 or 10 is a good age, but the exact age isn't really the point, I don't think. What is the point is that without the power to support or defeat elected officials, there is little reason for those in office to take the best interests of children seriously. And so they don't. And so 22% of American children live below the poverty line, as if somehow they're to blame for choosing their parents badly, that they deserve what they get. Giving children the vote will be the first step in ending child slavery, child poverty, poor education, trafficking. First step. I think democracy can no longer afford to continue without it. A couple things to say about giving human rights to children, how it affects human rights generally. There's a Yale historian named Sam Moyne, who's written, very smart man, very, very good man. I know him a little bit, who's written several books that are critiques of the human rights movement and the human rights international institutions. And his new book is called Not Enough. Great title. Human Rights in an Unequal World. Essentially, his argument is that the last 25 years, human rights community, human rights effort have succeeded wildly in the area of political, legal rights and rights of person. And so political rights or human rights organizations have just ignored other rights that are the fundamental of real human equality. Social and economic rights, in other words. And in so ignoring them, Moyne blames the human rights people, the human rights movement, for creating our age of inequality, in which the extraordinary inequality has grown as it has in this country. Not so much between the have and the have-nots, but Moyne says between the haves and the have-mores. I want to end by suggesting that social and economic rights, like environmental rights, education rights, healthcare, healthy standard of living, sustainable income, these are the human rights of children. These are the rights that children need to survive. If we began talking about human rights with the rights of children, those other rights would take priority. If we began there, these rights would be the first generation rights. In other words, beginning with the human rights of children is how those of us who want to try to address and ameliorate the vast and economic and social inequality that characterizes both the world as a whole and in the United States, that's where we need to start. I believe that recognizing the human rights of children as the first priority of those of us who seek a better, more equal world is how we can arrive there, how we can arrive at that new and better place. A child, maybe named Malala, or Greta, or Rabab, or Redeema, or David, or Emma, can show us the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. You gave us so much to think about. And I wanted to share with you a comment in the chat box and then a couple of questions.
Yep.
Casey says, I agree that children are largely an unrecognized group. In my research on eugenics in the US and Montana specifically, I have found that more than any other group category, children were primary targets of eugenicists. The average age of sterilized persons in Montana was 17, with some as young as 10. And we need to pay attention to youth as a category of analysis.
Wow, that's horrible. That's harrowing. I never heard that. But if you want, there's no better example of running roughshod over the rights of an individual than that.
Exactly. And then, talking to you earlier, I just was so appreciative of the fact that, in your book that you
Hold it up, will you? Show them the whole
Yeah,
cover.
there you go. It's an excellent read and it's not too big, so you can
Right.
read pretty quickly. But you talked about a lot of really current events. And so EIHR's librarian, Matthew Good, who's on the call, he wants to know your thoughts on students' intellectual freedom rights, especially given the current push to remove books from school libraries.
Yeah, I mean, we go through this in this country every few decades. I think because the issue of, children's freedom to read what they want to read is never framed in the context of the right of the child. It's always framed in the context of the right of their parents to decide. I'm very skeptical of whether those rights exist at all. Let me put it a slightly different way. This country invented public education. It is one of the great gifts that the United States has given to the world. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. And the purpose of public education has two main points: to benefit the child who's being educated, and to benefit society as a whole by having an educated citizenry. And the first 200 years of this country's history is the story of how we as a country excelled beyond all other because of our educated citizenship. We were the only country for decades that had free public education through high school. It's why people like President Obama want to expand that to, and President Biden too, to junior college, because we're kind of falling behind. It was our invention. Other countries have taken it on the better, but that's the real reason. It's never been seen as the right of children and the benefit to society. When people call it, the right of parents to decide, they're missing what is essential to public education. It's too bad that Terry McAuliffe said what he said in the Virginia governor's race, saying we don't want parents dictating to schools, but that's the absolute truth. We don't want parents dictating to schools. It's not their right to do that.
Thank you. And Kate, I would love for you to ask the question that you had in the chat box.
Yes, and I'm seeing that we're getting some responses to it from our friends in Bosnia. So Rich, I'm wondering, what does it mean when a country has ratified the convention? What consequences could unfold, if any, if the convention is broken? So particularly here, I'm thinking that, I was just looking up some information, and Bosnia and Herzegovina signed on in September of 1993. And by the end of the siege and the end of the war in 1995-96, the loss of children just in the siege of Sarajevo was reprehensible. But is there any consequence specific to breaking the convention? I mean, what protections does it offer? What's the real impact of having ratified it?
So ratification means, at least in this country, it would become the law of the land. So that would mean that it would carry penalties like every other law in the United States when broken. Now, it doesn't set penalties necessarily, but it would mean that people could be sued, people could go to jail because they had violated the rights of children in this country. Parents do go to jail sometime for that. We never say that it's because they violated their children's rights. Of course, as you well know, Kate, since you are a human rights expert, and most of the people on this call, I think, are, that human rights, the effectiveness of human rights really comes through the national will to enforce them. I mean, you could say that's true of any law in any country, right? If the police are not enforcing the speed limit, then it might be the speed limit, but it doesn't really have the impact that you want to have. The same would certainly be true for treaties that the United States ratifies. Although when this country has ratified other treaties, it has made them the law of the land. We finally ratified the Genocide Convention. That's an interesting story. In the Reagan administration, he did it basically because he was getting hammered politically. So he said, I know, this will bring me some good press.
Thank you, Senator.
I actually wrote the Trump administration when there were children being put in cages. And I said, listen, what you guys could do that would really get you off the hook, not that I want you to be, but it would get you off the hook, is tell the Senate to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It would have been a brilliant move. I never heard back from them, but, and I haven't been named Secretary of State either, so it's not likely to happen. But, you know, the impact it would carry, it would be the law of the land.
So that explains it here in the United States. But in countries that have ratified it, I mean, so with the Genocide Convention, for example, there's an obligation for the international community to act if something is recognized as a genocide, which is why there's such high stakes in actually making that recognition. Is there anything like that for the international community for the rest of the world that's ratified this convention?
The Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Right. Yeah.
Well, countries do take action. It doesn't usually take the form of invasion or something like that, but countries will stop international contracts on the grounds that there's too much violation of children's rights in this country. I mean, why is it that every country, when a revolution happens and the new government's trying to establish its bona fides, that it says things like, we recognize the human rights of all our citizens, because they want to avoid those consequences. Those consequences are real. They're not always that visible to the ordinary citizen, but we live in a pretty interconnected world. And, you know, short of government officials being arrested and hauled before the International Criminal Tribunal, which also does happen, you know, these political economic steps taken against governments that violate the rights of children do happen.
Thank you so much. Couple of other questions, and I'm going to connect these two. First of all, most of our audience today are teachers, and I think that this should be taught, you know, your book or this, at the very least, this topic in teacher preparation classes, because this is never covered in those, and it's such a big part of what we do. So what else can we do as teachers to further promote the rights of children? And then secondly, you know, how do we get our elected officials to support legislation that helps children? Because they just seem so against it, you know, here in the US at least. We still don't have healthcare for children, public education's under attack. I mean, just, you know, all of these things. So how do we do both of those as educators?
Well, I think a couple of things that you've already said. The Convention on the Rights of the Child begins with a statement that every signatory country promises to educate children on their rights. That's the first thing that it says after the preamble. We haven't ratified it, so we don't have to worry about that. The first thing that should just happen is that teachers should be doing lesson plans and segments on human rights, and having discussions with children whether they think they have them. Now, I would bet you that there's a lot of children in American schools as young as 8, 10 years old. They've heard of people like Greta Thunberg. They've heard of children all around the world who are having this huge impact. And I can just tell you that, you know, I've started and run 2 human rights programs at the college level. By the time they're 17 and in college, they're really excited about it. Most of them because they've never heard about it for the first time. I usually joke about this. Well, you've all had this in high school and middle school, right? And they laugh. But when they're 17, they're excited. That would happen when they're 14. That would happen when they're 10. I just think that more and more it is happening. Some states, Michigan is the first state that officially declared that a human rights segment must be part of the curriculum in high school education. It was one of the things our former governor did, just maybe to change the subject about the Flint water crisis. But those are often great opportunities. And one thing you can say is, if you're getting a lot of bad publicity, how about doing something for the human rights of children? That might really help. So that might be a politically savvy way. But I just think that teachers, you know, need to be arguing to put these things into curriculum, and students will respond. They love them. It could be, you know, just an element on child activists around the world. And, you know, look at Greta Thunberg in Glasgow for the last 2 weeks. She led a march of just children. one of those days. It's happening. It's current events.
Well, Rich, thank you so much. I think I got all the questions in the chat box. Let me know, anybody, if I missed yours, but I think I got everything. This has been a great talk, a lot to think about. Again, I hope that everybody gets the chance to read the book.
Available on Kindle too.
Yes, yes. And again, so much interesting information that you shared and a lot for us to work on. Kate put the webinars for the next 2 sessions in the chat box, so please register if you haven't already, and we hope to see you again. If you do have any follow-up questions for Rich, feel free to reach out to us at EIHR, and we'll get those to him. And again, thank you so much, Rich. This has been wonderful.
Thanks very much. Pleasure
Good to
be
see you
here.
as always, Rich. Thank you for agreeing to be with us today.
A great organization that I'm very excited about. So,
Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you to everybody who came from Bosnia. My goodness, you're up late.
Thank you.
Thank you.